I'm Thierry Heles. This is The Next Leap. Did you know that technology transfer started with the discovery of vitamins and how to put them into food? 2025 marks 100 years since Harry Steenbock, who grew up on a farm before becoming a professor at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, figured out how to fortify food with vitamin D. Steenbock found a group of fellow UW-Madison alumni and established the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation, the first ever tech transfer office, to license his invention to companies like Quaker Oats, ensuring that revenue from his invention and that of colleagues in future would come back to the university. It wasn't all smooth sailing. WARF's inception significantly predates the Bayh-Dole Act, which was passed in 1980 to allow universities to exploit their IP, so there were several run-ins with the US government in those first 5.5 decades. But by the late 70s, WARF's expertise actually helped shape the Bayh-Dole Act. Over the past century, WARF has licensed a flurry of inventions. Many of them you'll recognize, like blood thinner warfarin, pluripotent stem cells, and even the cranberries in your cranberry juice. Today's guest is Kevin Walters, who wrote his PhD on the history of WARF and now serves as the organization's public affairs associate. And we'll talk about why all of this could only have happened in Wisconsin. Kevin, welcome.
Thanks, Derek. Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
I look forward to this conversation very much. And I guess if you start a podcast, you might as well start at the very beginning of tech transfer, which is what we will be talking about today. But maybe let's start with what WARF is. Can you give me an overview of the organization?
Sure. So WARF stands for the Wisconsin Alumni Research Foundation. We are, as you alluded to, the first university-based tech transfer organization back in 1925, which back at that time, tech transfer was not a term in use, not a term that was applied to this. We were founded to manage patents and develop commercial applications and products out of those by licensing them to companies. That's what we started to do and what we still do. I think there were other universities who had looked at commercializing individual patents. I think University of Toronto and insulin was a major example. There was also the Research Corporation, which offered its services to multiple universities. WARF was the first one that said, we're going to have an office that's dedicated specifically to the University of Wisconsin-Madison, so the Wisconsin flagship public university. All of our trustees are alumni of UW-Madison, and WARF was designed to be dedicated specifically to UW-Madison and to accept inventions going forward. So it wasn't for one particular invention. It was for any professor who wanted to come to WARF and say, I have an idea, let's see if we can make something out of it. We were going to do that in an ongoing basis. So I'm guessing most of your listeners who've found their way here will know what tech transfer is, but that's kind of the basics there.
We'll get into more kind of the details of how that happened and what the history is in more detail. But you are a non-profit organization, which means that you have trustees. Can you give me a bit of a flavor of who these people are, even if you don't want to name anyone? If you do, feel free.
Yeah, so the A in WARF is alumni, and so we are independent of the university, meaning we don't report up to our chancellor. Our chancellor is one of our trustees as an ex officio member, as is our CEO. But other than those two members, everyone, in order to be a trustee of WARF, you have to have gone to the University of Wisconsin at Madison. And I say at Madison because it's only specifically this campus. So UW-Milwaukee, UW-Eau Claire, those are separate campuses. We only support UW-Madison. And so our trustees have been very distinguished. I think UW, for a very long time, had the distinction of being one of the universities that produced the most Fortune 500 CEOs. And we've had, I think, close to 20 of them over the 100 years. I think it's more something around 15 to 17, somewhere in there, have been Fortune 500 CEOs. We're talking about like the CEO of Campbell Soup, CEO of Kimberly-Clark, of Whirlpool, of AT&T, back when AT&T was Ma Bell, and it was the phone company. It was a man named H.I. Romness was on our board. So some pretty distinguished people. I think also probably the most famous, the names that I will drop. So if you know the Nielsen rating system, so the Nielsen families who determine ratings for television shows, like how many people are watching, both Arthur Nielsen Sr. and Arthur Nielsen Jr. were trustees of WARF at different times. And Art Nielsen Jr. was actually a chair of our board, what was called the president of the board at the time. So they're pretty distinguished people. And I think they really kind of hold us to the bottom line, really make sure that we're doing the best. I think today we have scientists, entrepreneurs, people who have served in government positions, those different things. The common denominator is that they've gotten degrees from UW-Madison. and they're successful in business and in law and in government. So they're very distinguished people. It's really kind of intimidating. One of the most intimidating experiences I've had is trying to present to our trustees. They're impressive people.
I'm not even sure I can imagine, but I definitely hear you. Those are very impressive names and very impressive companies that I think people will know whether they're in the US or not. Are there any disadvantages to being an independent organization? Is there a danger of friction with the university for different needs or wants that the organizations have?
Well, yeah, so this is the interview question where you say my biggest weakness is how much I care, right? The biggest advantage of it is that we are able to create our own culture. We're able to offer the university an independent voice. We're able to more freely tell a professor, hey, look, we love your work. It's great, but we don't see a commercial application. And it's a little easier for us to have those conversations. They can trust us because we do have this distinguished board of trustees, and we're able to bring in people who are saying, I'm not really interested in being an associate vice chancellor, but I am interested in being, say, a chief venture officer or running a biotech company within WARF, things like that. So that's the advantage. I think the other thing, too, is that we have to be very careful to make sure that we are connected to the university, that we're listening to them, that we understand what's going on there. I think there's an example in the 1980s where the university was getting very frustrated that WARF didn't seem to think that computer science could really be patented or could be, developed, that there wasn't really a pathway forward there. It's certain things like that where we have to make sure that we're ahead of the university on some of these things. Otherwise, we're not serving them well. If we fall behind, then we're not serving them well. And we could actually end up in a situation where we're not a premier tech transfer office because we're not listening to what really universities are demanding of their tech transfer offices. But on balance, I would say that really keeps us on our toes. I think it's a good thing that we can't get lazy. We have to reinvent ourselves just about every 10 to 20 years, really.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. As you said in your previous answer, 1925, you were founded. 100 years of WARF now, centennial anniversary. I want to look back a little bit further than 1925, because I think that's actually where your PhD dissertation started as well. What were the conditions for WARF? How did this come about? What was medicine like at the time?
I was actually hired as an intern to look through some historical documents of WARF, and then I eventually turned into a dissertation. And my original idea was that I was going to write about more current day stuff or more recent, or not current day, I'm a historian, but was going to bring it forward from 1925. And the more I looked at it, the more I realized the real story here is how WARF grew out of what the University of Wisconsin really is. And so back then it was just University of Wisconsin because Madison was the only campus. And University of Wisconsin is pretty unique in the number of disciplines that we host. So I think the only thing we don't have is maybe a dental school and architecture school, but we have a College of Agriculture, we have a College of Letters and Sciences, we have a College of Engineering. And the history of how that came about is that, so in the United States, when a new state was founded as the country grew out to the west, obviously when you moved to Iowa or Wisconsin, you didn't have a Yale or a Harvard. And so one of the first things that they did, in fact, in most states when they were founded, and even a condition on becoming a state of the union sometimes, was you have to create a university, a state flagship university, with the idea being you're going to train the lawyers, the ministers, the bankers, like the elite of your state. You're going to create a leadership class by having a public university. And then I would say that in the 1860s, during the Civil War, there was a second wave of college creation, which was about agricultural and mechanical sciences, in which Congress said, if you agree to focus on agricultural sciences and mechanical sciences, basically sort of working class disciplines, then we'll give you a land grant. And it was land that was from the West, that was taken from native tribes. And they said, we're going to sell this land, and the proceeds from that, we're going to create a university around it, as long as you promise to do what Congress asks. So that's a little bit of a complicated background, but what it basically gets in is you have these two lanes. You have this elite leadership kind of university, and you have a agricultural university. And for a variety of reasons that are probably too long of a story to tell here, Wisconsin ended up putting both of those in the same place in Madison. So you have the traditional, liberal arts happening here. You also have a College of Agriculture happening here. And that created a kind of centripetal force, the one that pulls things together. So there was tension in which you had farmers who were very concerned that if they sent their kids to Madison, they were going to turn into lawyers and move off to Manhattan, and they weren't going to come back to the farm. And so UW-Madison and the lawyers at UW-Madison actually said, we can't allow that to happen. If we're going to get support from our state, we're a public university, the state supports us, we need to serve the farmers. And so they're very intentional about building a program. They had something called the winter course, which is when farmers weren't bringing in the harvest, they could come to Madison and learn about agricultural trades and tools. And so that's really how Wisconsin ends up becoming the dairy state. I think people in the United States will kind of know Wisconsin for cheese. I don't know how globally that's well known. But Wisconsin prides itself on being the dairy state. And the reason that happened was because Wisconsin realized we need to serve our farmers. We can't really compete. We're not a plains state the way that Nebraska is, or Iowa or Kansas. We can't really grow wheat the way that they can. But what can we do? Well, we have hills and valleys and things, and it turns out it's very well suited for dairy, for cows. And so Wisconsin was the first place that really started thinking about, okay, how do you grow cows to produce milk as opposed to growing bulls to produce meat? Then the other thing that they did, but then they turned to the university because Wisconsin's a cold state. It's in the north. And so they turned to the university to say, how do we compete with places like California where it's warmer? And so they actually invented the cold curing of cheese. They developed enzymes that enabled cheese to be developed at room temperature and colder. And one of the big changes at UW-Madison was a guy named Babcock who invented the butterfat milk test, which was a pretty simple device by today's terms, but it was a centrifuge that allowed anybody to test how much fat was in milk. So if you're a wholesaler and you're getting milk from the farm and the farmer says, well, this is 2% milk, or this has a certain level of fat in it, you don't have to take his word for it. You can just test it there in the centrifuge. And so one of the jokes was that Babcock made more men honest than the Bible because it rationalized the systems. So these things actually turned dairy from an ancient trade into a modern science. And that's really where Wisconsin then bought tremendous goodwill from the farmers. And we actually built like a dairy barn, which was kind of this extravagant show palace of all the new agricultural techniques. And it really made Wisconsin what it is. So we could continue to train lawyers, could continue to train philosophers and historians, while also training these farmers. And then they both benefited from each other. That was kind of what UW-Madison was entering into the 1920s.
That is very cool. And I hadn't realized how much of a role the university played in this becoming the cheese state, which I'm not even sure why I knew that Wisconsin was the dairy state, because I obviously don't live in the US. It's something that has reached these parts of the world anyway. WARF's founder, Harry Steenbock, himself was a professor of agricultural chemistry, if I got that right. He grew up on his family farm. How did those views then inform the creation of WARF, or his approach to creating this tech transfer office?
Yeah, so he's a professor of agricultural chemistry. That department was renamed as biochemistry. It predated biochemistry, but it's not medical chemistry or some other term. It was really agriculture that he was being formed. And so he grew up on a farm north of Wisconsin. His family actually sold the farm and moved south to Madison with him. And that was a not uncommon thing to do in those times. The way that you got money was by selling the farm and then moving. And then his father worked as a handyman around the department. And so, yes, his advisor was a guy named E.B. Hart, who was actually a student of Babcock, who I mentioned earlier. And one of the implications of all of Babcock's work was they were really focusing on feeds and feeding. There's a book called Feeds and Feeding that Wisconsin produced, which was all about telling farmers the ideal mix of grains to feed to your cows. And one of the things that they had determined was that the ideal way to grow a cow for health was to feed them corn. The question then emerged, okay, why corn? Why is corn better than wheat? Well, it has less protein than wheat. It has more sugar than oats. What is it about it? So Hart was the one who, using science that Babcock had originated, put together an experiment which really tested, okay, if we doctor wheat and corn and oats to have the same number of macronutrients, and we feed those to the cows, what's going to happen? And what they determined was, well, there's different nutritional outcomes, and that some of them who weren't fed the corn were actually having stillborn cows and were going blind. And this was one of the first experiments that actually proved that vitamins existed. And so before this, macronutrients, it was thought, okay, all you have to do is eat the right balance of proteins, carbohydrates, and fats, and you're fine. And Babcock was the one who said, I could actually doctor a piece of cow dung to have that perfect balance in it, and I'm not going to feed that to a cow, much less to my child. There's something wrong here. And that's what birthed this experiment. And it showed what they called accessory factors or micronutrients. And so Wisconsin was really the place where vitamin A was discovered. And Steenbock was specifically working in vitamin D. So what were called the fat-soluble vitamins. So the vitamins that dissolve in the fat in your body rather than through water. In the beginning, they thought that there was one fat-soluble vitamin, and Steenbock came along as a student of Hart when they were determining that vitamin A and vitamin D were two separate things. So some of his early papers are actually determining that it's the yellow in corn where the vitamins come from. This yellow pigment is associated with the fat-soluble vitamin in some way. And so that was really informing his research. If I keep going down that road, we'll take the entire time talking about Steenbock. But to sort of cut to the chase, so WARF's first invention is the vitamin D fortification process. The sun hits your skin, and the cholesterol in your skin becomes something called cholecalciferol, which is vitamin D. And what Steenbock determined was that the same process works in food. So if you expose certain animal fats and plant fats to ultraviolet light, it creates vitamin D fortified food. And he patented that process. That was WARF's first invention. And the reason why he got there first, that's a whole complicated academic question as to people getting there first and what does that mean? What does invention really mean? All that kind of things. But the reason why he created WARF and other people in this field didn't was because he was an agricultural chemist. Most of the people he was competing with were doctors. They're paediatricians. They were doing yeoman's work, really great work, really important work. One of them was a woman who worked for the Lister Institute. Harriet Schick was her name. And she was actually working in Vienna after World War I, just trying to figure out why children had bowed legs. And so they're all approaching this question from the point of view of why did children get sick when they're not eating the right things? That's a nutritional question. It's a medical question. Steenbock's approaching this from the other end of the question, which is how do we create food that's optimal for cows, and how do we then get that food into humans? So he's approaching this from an agricultural mindset, from a farmer's mindset. He's asking different questions. And so If you're a medical doctor, the question of whether you're going to become rich off of your work is a significant ethical question. If you spent your whole career helping farmers get better at making money on their farms, you don't really see it that way. You see it as like, this is what I do. What we're all trying to do is make sure that science can help our economy become more efficient. The other distinction I would make is that Steenbock was not working for corporations. He was not working in industrial labs. He was not a capitalist. He was not a businessman. He was a agricultural chemist. So when he has this invention and Quaker Oats basically finds out about it. So Quaker Oats, there was a study that showed that oatmeal led to people having weak teeth because oatmeal didn't have enough vitamins in it. So Quaker Oats saw this as a significant liability. They actually had a farm in Madison. So they were paying attention to the work that was going on there. They found out about Steenbock's work and they said, hey, look, we'll pay you for this if you give us your invention and we'll go make fortified oatmeal and we'll make you a lot of money. And the original contract that WARF ended up signing with Quaker Oats was worth $1 million. So basically the idea was that Steenbock turned down the opportunity to become a millionaire. And the reason he did that was because he was thinking about Wisconsin farmers who quite literally paid his paycheck. If it wasn't farmers, it was the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Like he's thinking about this in a very different way. And he's thinking, I don't know how to do business. I don't want to do business, but I want to make sure that nothing I do will lead the farmers to say that I'm selling them out, that I'm one of these kids who's going to go become a businessman in Manhattan, right? That's going to move away and never come back to the farm. So he's really thinking about it in those terms. And that's really kind of how it informs WARF. That combination of factors is what leads to a professor and the deans who work with him thinking, there's an opportunity here that we can really create something that will be sustaining that I don't think anybody else would have thought about in the world. And that they didn't. There were people who were thinking about similar questions. They were recognizing the value of patents, but they didn't overcome those hurdles because they weren't thinking about it the right way. They weren't thinking about it as farmers.
It's utterly fascinating. I'm also kind of a big fan of these, farming is a very manual labor process. And, he was a professor, he was a researcher. But I really like these breakthroughs that we really owe to people that have come from manual labor and not the thinkers in the ivory towers, which I think is traditionally what maybe people think of, the big philosophers of the world. They come up with the great new ideas. But no, it was a guy who grew up on a farm and knew what the farming industry needed and really came at it from that angle. And then that really created this really quite phenomenal thing in Wisconsin and spread throughout the world really now.
It's also a combination of things. So, Steenbock, he spoke German until the age of 5 because in Wisconsin, it was all German immigrants. And so he trained in Germany at some time. And E.B. Hart and Babcock, they all got degrees over in Europe because at the time, Europe was where the great scientists were being trained. So I just say that because it's the combination of things. It's basically working with their hands and getting dirty, but it's also bringing in world-class science and making sure that that ivory tower doesn't become a true ivory tower and get detached. So in Wisconsin, we talk about the Wisconsin idea, which is that what happens at the university should benefit every person in the state. And I think it's both sides of those halves. And that tension is really, I think, what creates a lot of the genius.
Yeah. Do you have any examples of other universities maybe in the early days that did come to Madison and looked at what Steenbock had done and maybe wanted to replicate it in their own states?
Yes, there were a number. And I think in the 20s and 30s, by the 30s, you really have kind of a cottage industry of what we would now call tech transfer offices. But back then, were called patenting offices and research foundations. And so Iowa State was the second one. Purdue had one. There were a number of others that were not coincidentally founded around what we call the Big Ten in the Midwest in the United States. So they were state universities that were modeling what they did after WARF. When I was looking through the archives, I found a report from Yale that they came to WARF and were asking, okay, how did you do this? Why was it successful? How could we replicate this? One of Steenbock's mentors was actually Lafayette Mendel, who worked at the Connecticut Agricultural Experiment Station attached to Yale, and he was also working in the vitamin space. And so Yale came to WARF to say, how do we do this? And that's been something that I think a lot of people have come to WARF over the years. My mentor, who was Carl Gabranson, preceding CEO of WARF, the managing director of WARF at the time, he would tell me that every few years or so, somebody would come by and say, how do we replicate what WARF did? And he would always say, well, you got to start 100 years ago and save your money, because that's how he did it, right? The answer that we would always give people is there were some very specific historical circumstances that allowed us to be successful. And what you really should be doing is looking at how your university operates, how your ecosystem operates, and what are the opportunities and how do you make that work, as opposed to just copying WARF. But I think, yes, if you see any organization around the country, and there are a lot of them that have the term RF, Research Foundation, they're drawing upon WARF in some way. I would say that the hardest thing to replicate is the true independence of WARF. So as I said, the chancellor's on our board, but that's actually a recent development. It was only around the year 2000 when we started adding the chancellor to the board. It was actually an IRS question, which was that we wanted to demonstrate that we really were integrated with the university. But before that, we were actually very careful to not have anybody who worked at the university on the board. So it really is truly independent. And the reason that happened was because nobody really understood what patenting could do, the opportunities. They saw patenting as a risk. You had to spend money to patent. And universities had never done that. And so actually when Steenbock came to the university and said, I don't want to sell this to Quaker Oats, I want the university to do it, they basically didn't give him an answer. Like, they didn't even say no. They just kind of like, we're not going to touch it. We're not going to talk about that. They did hire a lawyer to help him with actually a previous invention to kind of try to do something, but they never got around to it, and the patent actually wasn't filed in time before it was publicly disclosed. But the reason I say that is because a lot of people will try to create a research foundation, but most universities recognize now the value of intellectual property, and they're not going to let it go. And so had WARF been founded, I think even 20 or 30 years later, we would not have been as independent as we were. And I can understand why the university would say that, but it happened to work out for us. We've had to navigate some headwinds, but we've made it work. But I don't think any university could truly recreate what WARF became.
Yeah, not unless they invent the time travel machine first, as you said. Yeah, go back 100 years.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, the other historical thing to mention is that we were founded in 1925. We signed our first licensing deal in 1928. We started earning money in 1929. So if you know anything about history, 1929 is the perfect time to get in the stock market because that's the beginning of the Great Depression. So we started investing our money, and then we chose to invest the money rather than spend it. And so that's really the secret to WARF.
Are there other things that WARF has done first over the years that are now more common practice across tech transfer?
Well, it's, as a historian, it's kind of tricky because saying you did it first is kind of proving a negative. And like I said, if you want to say we were the first university to patent, that's not quite true. If you want to say we were the first university to develop a successful invention, that's not quite true. But what we did in all of its specifics is unique. And I think that's generally speaking what you find about WARF is that universities have understood for a while that we need to support startups. They've understood for a while that maybe a venture fund would be a good idea and that we need to have more intensive ways of developing drugs. I don't know that WARF can take credit for being first in those things, but we can recognize those things and we've been able to build them in a way that I think is unique. I would say the biggest example of something where we really broke ground was with what became the Bayh-Dole Act, which is the legislation that allows universities to retain patents on federally funded research. And before the Bayh-Dole Act, it was actually Harry Steenbock's last grad student, a man named Hector DeLuca, who went on to become our most prolific inventor and has made more money for WARF than any other inventor. He walked into WARF one day and basically said, hey, my advisor, Harry Steenbock, created this place and patented it. I have an idea. Would you want to take it? And at the time, WARF was basically getting no disclosures because the federal government claimed the rights to anything that's federally funded. But there happened to be a guy named Howard Bremer, who when Howard Bremer was hired as our patent counsel in the early 60s, his boss actually told him, don't get too comfortable because we're pretty sure that this is going the way of the dodo. Like, university patenting is not going to be a thing in 10 years. So we need you for a few years, but this is not going to be a long-time career. Well, Howard actually was still working at WARF part-time when he passed the late 80s. Wow. But he didn't take no for an answer, and he was looking for a solution. And when Hector DeLuca walked in, he said, well, here's an opportunity. And he and a guy named Bill Young, who is a vice chancellor at the university, they went to the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare, which is now Health and Human Services, and specifically to NIH, National Institutes of Health. And they found a general counsel there named Norm Latker, and they negotiated. And they figured out a way so that the invention that DeLuca had brought to them could be waived and the university could patent that. That led to what was called an institutional patent agreement. So WARF signed the first institutional patent agreement with the National Institutes of Health. That agreement set the basis and the framework that ultimately led 12 years later to the passage of the Bayh-Dole Act, because the institutional patent agreement basically said anything that the University of Wisconsin is doing that's NIH funded, we will allow them to patent it, and then UW allowed WARF to be the one to handle those patents. And so we really figured out a way to make that happen and then started the process. I wouldn't take sole credit for WARF. There was a lot of other universities in the 1970s that really made Bayh-Dole happen, but we were the first ones to really find the path that worked. And I think that's kind of the way for WARF, is that a lot of people are dealing with a lot of the same questions, a lot of the same challenges. And WARF, because of who we are, because of the need to adapt, has really found a way to make things work in a way that I think a lot of other universities haven't, to really be successful at commercializing research.
Yeah, I like the idea that the basis for the Bayh-Dole Act ended up being almost a loophole that the university managed to find with the NIH, kind of going against what the federal government would have done otherwise. I'm not sure there's a lot of people out there that necessarily know that detail. It's certainly not something that I had come across before. Obviously, I know about the Bayh-Dole Act, as I'm sure everyone who will listen to this will be aware of. But yeah, it's quite an interesting piece of history that it was an agreement with just one federal organization, NIH, to begin with. The University of Wisconsin-Madison also has a unique feature in the US anyway. A professor who makes a discovery without using any federal funds could choose to not come to WARF and commercialize it by themselves. They could file the patent themselves. They could own everything themselves. Why do you have this approach? Has anyone ever made use of it, or do people still come to WARF because they know you have the resources and they don't have to worry about paying a patent attorney and all those kinds of things?
It is rare, but it does happen. I think for us, it's a matter of both principle and tradition. that it's just we support our inventors, we believe in our inventors, we believe that the people who do the actual science are the ones who own it, that an inventor is the one who did the inventing, not the person who funded it, not the person who employs them. That's kind of a principle for us. In reality, there are lots of legal reasons that are very good reasons as to why, say, if you work for a private corporation, you're assigning all your IP to them. So I'm not necessarily sort of, what's the right colloquialism, but, it's spitting into the wind or it's fighting an uphill battle. And I don't think it's worth fighting that. But it is a matter of principle for us to say, regardless of what the law says, we believe that our inventors are the ones who hold that invention. In practicality, the way that it works, it's a complicated process, but I think I can lay it out in a way that will make sense for your listeners. UW-Madison and WARF have an agreement that basically says that professors are not required to assign, but they are required to disclose to WARF. Okay. And what that means is when you have an invention, you have to disclose it so that the university then can do an assessment to say, okay, are there any contractual obligations? Was there federal funding involved? And not just federal funding, but also private funding. Like, could there be a clause in a contract we signed 10 years ago for sponsorship that impinges upon this? Mm-hmm. And so then they do what's called an equity review, and they figured that out once they've assigned to WARF. And we worked it out so that happens simultaneously, that when they disclose to WARF, they also are alerting the university research and sponsored programs that they need to be evaluating this. If they make that evaluation and they determine that there's no federal funding and that there are no contractual obligations, then it's possible for the professor to say, I'd rather do this myself, or I'd rather not give this to WARF. It very seldom happens because most professors recognize that WARF is offering very valuable services. Our services are free. Because we've made money over the years, we're actually self-sustaining. And so the university doesn't have to pay anything for tech transfer services because WARF does that. That's the biggest advantage of us being separated, of us having accumulated the resources that we have over the years, is that we're able to do that. And so most professors recognize, I've got these free services. I don't have to hire a lawyer. I can just go to WARF and they'll do this for me. And if they do something out of it, I'm going to get an inventor's share. Right. So, on the other side, if you take it yourself, you're not going to get an inventor share. You're going to get all of it. Are you going to actually do that? Harry Steenbock understood that had he licensed it to Quaker, something could have happened in oatmeal, but it wasn't going to happen in vitamin D milk or vitamin D pharmaceuticals or vitamin D yeast or vitamin D bread, right? He kind of intuitively understood that. He also understood that if he just tried to do this himself, he said he'd never even seen a patent in his life before he tried to file one. So most professors, I think, recognize they don't want to be lawyers. Some of them don't even want to be businessmen, right? So it's very rare that a professor will say, thanks, but no thanks to WARF, even beyond the fact that most research at this point involves some kind of federal funding. There are instances. So Hector DeLuca, who I mentioned, his invention got us to that first institutional patent agreement. My understanding is that later in his career, he actually didn't take federal funding. He was able to because he was getting funds from WARF for his royalties. But for him, it was also a matter of principle, and he had bad memories of what it was like before the Bayh-Dole Act, that he actually, I just don't want to deal with this. And he actually did not take federal funding. But he also had a great relationship with WARF. I think we served each other really, really well. And so he always worked with us and never went out on his own. I think if I knew the names of others who've had bad experiences by doing that, I probably wouldn't name them just because I don't want to cast aspersions and I don't really know the story.
No, that's totally fair.
But I have heard things about people who got in trouble with conflicts of interest or with even malpractice suits and those kinds of things because they didn't have the expertise to manage these kind of things the way that WARF does. So as I said, it's certainly a matter of principle and a matter of practice. It's rare, but it's still an important principle for us that we really want to tell our inventors, we value what you do and we're not taking ownership away from you. We're just providing you a service that will benefit the university as a whole.
Yeah, that makes complete sense. Certainly if I was in that position, I would want to go to an organization that knows how to handle all of these things and, go back to my lab and do what I'm good at. One of the many interesting stories that have come out of WARF, and this podcast is way too short to cover everything, from James Thompson made stem cell discoveries, Corinne Sohi developed technologies that make iPhones faster or microchips faster. But there is also the story of margarine, which I think is an interesting one because it plays to Wisconsin's place as a dairy state and also an example of international activities for WARF. Can you tell me a little bit more about this particular story?
Sure. Yeah, the first thing that I would say is that, full stop, the reason why Harry Steenbock got interested in patenting in the first place was because he was concerned that his vitamin technologies would be used by the margarine industry and it would damage the butter industry, which Wisconsin being the dairy state, that was very concerning. And the specific concern was that if it got out that a Wisconsin invention was being used for, Fleischmann's margarine to make them more nutritious than butter, the farmers would bry it and the university would lose its public funding. That was the concern. And so the reason he started patenting, once he decided to make the patent, there were lots of other reasons why he ended up founding WARF. And I think down the line, most of the people who got involved with WARF were not motivated by this, but they all recognized the political reality. Early in the days when Steenbock was talking about he wanted to patent this, he was bringing it to his colleagues, to the faculty in his department. A lot of them disagreed with him. They all had different opinions about whether you should do this. The one thing that they all agreed on was we can't allow this to be licensed to the margarine manufacturers because we can't make the dairy farmers mad. And so that was almost a unanimous opinion. And so when WARF was founded, one of the very first acts WARF did was we're going to accept Steenbock's patents. He's going to sign them to us, work out a deal with him that will allow him to do that. And once we do that, anybody we license this to is not going to be able to sub-license to margarine companies, what they refer to as oleomargarine, or basically substitutes for butter. And so that was like one of WARF's very first acts, because they recognized that this was a political hot button issue. And they were doing it because, okay, we're going over here and we're creating this nonprofit foundation that's a side of this public university. And there are other people that were concerned about that. The last thing we want to do is to say, this is the place that's ruining Wisconsin's reputation. So they passed this bylaw that said, we're not going to do this. And what's interesting then is that Steenbock, within several days after that first meeting, he was in attendance. He wrote a letter to the WARF's president and basically said, I find this really distasteful that you're singling out a single industry. I don't like this. What I'd rather you do is give me veto power over all licenses. And I don't want any money, by the way. He's like, so I don't want you to pay me, but I do want control over licenses, and I don't like what you're doing. And so it gives you a sense of how talented some of our early trustees were. They basically handled that, and they forced Steenbock to say, we want to give you money. We want to make you wealthy. We don't want you telling us what to do with our licenses because we know better how to do that. We're the ones negotiating with these companies. I'm getting off on a sidetrack here. But the point being, there's a very complicated history as to why this margarine thing happened. That's really fascinating to me because it tells you a lot about the different decision-making processes that were here. And it ultimately gets WARF in trouble. Another thing that I would say is this is not something WARF would do today. We would never single out a single industry. We would never just put it on the books that this particular invention cannot be licensed to X product. We think that that's not an ethical way of going about things. And it's also something that would probably be illegal in modern day regulations and things. I don't think it was illegal at the time. I don't think it was the right decision in hindsight, but I understand why they did it at the time. So to give you a sense of some of the trouble that they got in was that, so for one thing, in the United States, butter and milk are a great way to deliver vitamin D. Cod liver oil. So rather than having to drop cod liver oil, if you watch old cartoons, there's always a story, the kid who's like getting disgusted because he has to take a spoonful of cod liver oil. Well, we ended having to do that because you could do it with vitamin D and it didn't have to taste bad. But the different products that were licensed non-exclusively and in oatmeal, it ended up not working very well in oatmeal, by the way, but we did figure out that it worked very well in vitamin D milk. And I think that's actually one of the things that WARF proved that what tech transfer offices can do is that we put a lot of money into developing vitamin D milk. Because if you can imagine, exposing milk to ultraviolet light doesn't exactly milk very well. So it took us about 10 years to figure out how to do this. But now every store in America will have a big red label with vitamin D milk on it. Like that's how people get their vitamin D. That's not the case in Europe. Specifically, it's not the case in Britain. And so the Joseph Nathan Company was WARF's agent in Britain, and we licensed it to them. And this policy that you can't license to margarine companies carried over, and it made people in Britain incredibly mad because the easiest way in Britain to get vitamin D into particularly working class and poor families was to put it in margarine. And so this became a problem. When penicillin gets developed in the 1940s, part of the, I'm not going to remember the specifics or go into the details, but basically the way that penicillin was licensed in Britain was very much shaped by the bad experience they had with this margarine question with WARF and negotiating that. Long story short is by the time of 1941, World War II is winding around, WARF has removed all of this from their contracts. But they did end up having an investigation from the Antitrust Division of the Department of Justice, the United States, basically saying, we think you're asserting too much control over the vitamin D market, because at the time, vitamin D was not regulated. So the biggest concern of the Antitrust Division was that WARF was negotiating amongst its pharmaceutical licensees, which there are 5 of them, and basically making sure that none of them were undercutting each other or treating each other poorly. Well, the Antitrust Division saw that and said, well, that looks a lot like price fixing to us. So they started investigating WARF. And again, I'm kind of going off on a different road, but it gets back to this margarine question. And so Thurman Arnold, who's the Assistant Attorney General for the Antitrust Division, basically goes to WARF and says, hey, look, we'll get you in trouble if you don't do this, but how about we meet with you and they negotiate? And this is when WARF basically says, okay, we're going to stop doing the things that you have concerns about. Times have changed. It's the 1940s, not the 1920s. We're going to do things differently. George Haight, the founding president, said, there's things we wouldn't have done if we had to do over again. It was a very hot political question. Even to this day, there are laws on the books in Wisconsin that say that if you're in a restaurant, if you're going to offer margarine, you have to offer butter as well. So it's still a big issue in Wisconsin as to margarine there. So it's still kind of a hot topic. But outside of Wisconsin, it was the opposite, and it got WARF in a lot of trouble. Thurman Arnold ultimately becomes a federal judge, and the guy who replaces him in the Antitrust Division during World War II decides to target WARF and starts talking about them as being this sort of anti-margarine force and this cabal of global vitamin D and things like that. And so it becomes a real argument that WARF has to basically fights the Antitrust Division to a standstill and ultimately decides we're going to dedicate the Steenbock patents to the public, an agreement for the Antitrust Division leaving us alone. So that's a complicated history. But I think it's this thread of this original decision that I think made a lot of sense in context, which is WARF never would have been founded had they decided to go license to margarine companies. ends up in different contexts as it evolves over time, causing WARF a lot of trouble. And as I said, we would never do that today. But to me, it's a real lesson in understanding experimentation and how you sort of figure out the right way to do things. That WARF was willing to, right now we have to do this, but we're going to adapt. We're going to stop doing this later if we need to, and we're going to figure things out. And the reason why WARF was testing a lot of vitamin D was because the American Medical Association was concerned that if you put too much vitamin D in a product, it might become toxic. And so WARF sets up control laboratories and starts testing all of its products. And then the government starts saying, well, we don't really like this private nonprofit foundation being the one who's testing vitamin D products. We think we should be doing that. And so as the government grows, it kind of switches. But for about 50 years, WARF did have these control laboratories, and it got a good reputation for testing products. And so we started testing things like hair products and insecticides and all kinds of other things as we moved away from the vitamin D patents. And then ultimately we sold our laboratories in the 1970s. And then now there's a LabCorp facility in Madison that is still operating out of the WARF laboratories. And so it's one of these things where we just sort of evolved, and sometimes you go off in a direction that's maybe not the right way, but we'll course correct and we'll figure it out. I think margarine's the first example of where we made a controversial decision that got us to where we needed to be and then required us to then evolve and adapt later on.
Yeah. Again, really quite interesting, because I don't think margarine is really the number one product that would come to mind if you talk to anyone about the history of tech transfer. No one really think about the impact that margarine would have on WARF and how these things are approached more broadly. How has your international patenting approach specifically then evolved over the years, over the decades, or maybe even more recently than that?
Well, certainly, in the way it works now, I would defer to our licensing managers, and I know you'll be talking to some of them as well, and some of our current day leaders, who I think I'm just the opening act. Those guys are very compelling. I think you'll have a good conversation with them.
Yes, I will have Eric and Mike on next week.
Sorry if I'm spoiling the reveal, but...
No, that's fine.
So, I mean, WARF, from the beginning, like I said, we had licenses in Great Britain. We had actually international patents all around the world. The professor, who was a German professor, who won the Nobel Prize for determining how vitamin D works. So actually, Steenbock understood the process. Adolf Windhaus was the one who really understood what was happening in the body, and he got the Nobel Prize for that. We actually sub-licensed his patents. And so at a certain time, we were working with his patents. So we had international operations all around the world for vitamin D. And I think that's become a trend. Our second great invention was warfarin, which people may know as a very commonly prescribed blood thinner. The brand name is Coumadin. It's still the most widely prescribed blood thinner in the world, even though it was invented in the 1940s. And there's a famous case where it was also used as rat poison, because if it thinned the blood in a very small animal, that animal would die. It actually is therapeutic in humans to prevent blood clots. Anyway, there's a case where there was actually an epidemic in Bolivia that was actually ended by using warfarin to kill the rats that were causing it. And so that's kind of an example of how WARF has been internationally present around the world. And so we've always recognized both that there's an opportunity and also a kind of an obligation to make sure that what we're developing can spread around the world. Our current CEO has deep roots in global health. And so I think that's always something that we've been concerned about. And it's always a matter of balancing patent costs versus the opportunities that are out there. But yeah, I can't really speak to the rationale of why we do it or how we do it. But I think WARF has always had an international presence. It's never been just about Wisconsin. As we say, we want to enable UW-Madison research to solve the world's problems. That's really what our motivating purpose is. And you can't do that if you're not licensing things around the world. And we also want to bring back some of that to benefit the people of Wisconsin.
You mentioned WARF's early relationships with pharma industries. How has WARF's relationship with industry more broadly evolved over the years? Hopefully you're on good terms with the butter industry now.
Well, I mean, one of the ironies is that we never really got a lot of interest from butter companies to fortify things with vitamin D. Steenbock was always kind of confused and kind of angry about that like after all this I did for the butter industry, they weren't really ever interested in it. But the milk industry was. I can't really think of any examples where we really had a huge falling out with industry. I think obviously patents don't enforce themselves. We've had to file lawsuits against companies. I think generally speaking, those are resolved out of court, but sometimes they've gone to court and there have been cases of that. So particular companies have at certain times not liked WARF because we insist on making sure that our researchers are involved in the process and compensated for what they do. So that's the example where I think there might be some friction. But overall, I think WARF has a very strong reputation with industry. And as I said, people in industry are on our board. I think any tech transfer office, that's what you want. You want relationships with companies. We have a different motivation. We're a nonprofit. We support a university. Our ultimate goal is to solve problems and promote research, where obviously for-profit companies, their goal is to make profit. But that's why we like working with them, is because they can do that. They know how to commercialize things. They know how to get our products out into the marketplace. And that's a huge benefit to us. And I think that's true for any tech transfer office, and I think it's especially true of WARF.
I like that you brought up the lawsuits there as well, because I think a lot of people will have heard specifically about the Apple versus WARF court case. I'm not sure how it ended. I can't remember. But it's probably something that is worth mentioning. We're not going to talk about it because it's way beyond what this podcast is trying to cover. But I think it's worth acknowledging that, yes, you will pursue your patents in court if that's what's needed. And I think every tech transfer office out there would do the same. I want to move it slightly to the present day as we come to the end of this. Can you tell me a little bit about WISES as well?
Yes. So WISES was created in the year 2000. So WISES this year is celebrating its 25th anniversary as WARF is celebrating its 100th. WISES supports the 11 comprehensive universities around Wisconsin that are not in Madison. So to give you a little bit of the landscape, UW system, Madison is the flagship, then there's Milwaukee, which is also a tier 1 research university, and then there are 11 four-year universities. And so Milwaukee has its own research foundation. WISES was created in 2000 to make sure that we were offering the similar services to the other 11 universities. And WISES has been very well regarded for what it does. If you're talking about a comprehensive university that's really primarily about educating undergraduates, but also has professors who conduct research, it's a very different model for tech transfer. And you're going to have to think about how are we serving those communities. And so WARF was very much involved in creating WISES. They were actually an affiliate of ours for a number of years in the beginning as we kind of got them up to speed. But Arjun Sangha, who's the president of WISES, has really developed a model of supporting innovation on campuses. I think there's some really great examples of undergraduates who have become inventors because of WISES' support, hosting conferences and even helping professors write grants and those kind of things. They have a really great model there. Now they're actually applying for the NSF regional innovation engines to start an engine around sustainable agriculture. So they were given a $1 billion development grant for that. They're in the process of applying for the phase 2 through that. It gets us back to the beginning of our conversation, which is WISES looked around the state and said, how can we really serve the people of Wisconsin? They identified agriculture as something that's changing and where science and research can really help the people of Wisconsin adapt to that. It's a sad case of a lot of dairy farms closing, for example. But Wisconsin has also always had a very diverse agricultural sector. And so it's not just been dairy, it's been because of dairy, because it's not just wheat fields as far as the eye can see. There's been cranberries, there's been ginseng, there's been all kinds of other things. I think we're the biggest producer of cranberries. So it's a very interesting state. And WISES kind of said, okay, how can we adapt to the future? And they noticed that sustainable agriculture is the need. And so they're developing an engine that's going to bring together people around the state to really focus on this question. It's an exciting time in Wisconsin that we have these two institutions at their different levels of universities are really excelling.
That's very cool. I didn't realize that cranberries were being farmed. Is that the word? In Wisconsin as well, that you're known for that. That's very cool.
WARF actually has varieties of cranberries that we license. So high red cranberries, which is most commonly used in cranberry juice, was actually developed by a Wisconsin scientist, and WARF helped license it. Also, beets and potatoes. We have a lot of agricultural varieties. It's a less known aspect of tech transfer that we're still doing agriculture. We're going back to our roots, and we're still finding ways to make sure that chefs in New York City can have colorful beets. The Badger Flame beet, a great product of ours.
That's very cool. I probably have some of your stuff in my fridge. That almost brings us to the end. Is there anything else that we haven't mentioned that you want people to know, or any parting words that you want to reiterate?
Having dove into the details quite a bit, to maybe come back and try to paint a picture of the overall sweep of our history. We had a newspaper article in the Wisconsin State Journal, actually New Year's Eve or New Year's Day, but it was on the Sunday newspaper, talking about our 12 biggest inventions. And the reporter did something very interesting, was he talked about WARF as basically always having to fight for its life. Because I told him some of the stories that I was telling him about the antitrust investigation, about the margarine question, not getting into disclosures before the Bayh-Dole Act. And he said up until 1980, WARF was basically fighting for its life. And I was like, I never thought about that, because an organization that has had two inventions that were both earning over $100 million is not really fighting for its life, because we've had a lot of success. But it is true that we've faced a lot of headwinds and we've had to adapt. And I think there's always been this challenge, like we talked about. There's the Ivory Tower University, there's the working class university, there's the trades university, and Wisconsin wanting both of those things. You get political pressure from both sides of wanting to be that, and that evolves over years. In some ways, the debates have always been the same. It's always been farmers versus lawyers, or, Wall Street versus Main Street, all those kind of things. And WARF has always been in the middle of that. And I think our success is really due to adapting, not being beholden too much to tradition, to not thinking we've always done it this way, we're going to always keep doing this way, that we've always changed. And I think when you talk to Eric and Mike next week, you'll see that really in the last 15 years, WARF has had to reinvent itself again. We had some tremendous success with Hector DeLuca and with Carl Gabranson, who I mentioned. And as that generation came to a close, we had to stop and think, what's going to happen for the next 100 years? What's going to happen for the next 30 years? And I think if the story of the first 100 years is anything, WARF will be 4 or 5 different things, and we'll adapt. And I think some people might look at that and think, wow, you were brought up in front of hearings before Congress and being accused of all kinds of things by the antitrust division. How did that work? It's like, well, we changed some of the things we did. We refused to change some of the other things we did. And we went back to our researchers who are world class, who are doing great things. And we said, how can we help you? And somewhere along the way, the next generation of great research happens. And I'm hoping that will happen again with, if it's another pharmaceutical, if it's fusion energy. I think we've got some fusion technologies that are really great. if it's another computer science invention, if it's medical imaging, it might even just be data licensing or data sets or something like that. Or it might be the next great grant where we funded a computer science building on campus. We funded 50 different buildings on campus. To me, the story of WARF is coming up against things that other people might say, there's just no way you can get over this, and finding a way to get through it and finding the next great invention that's going to change the world. Also trying to be a little humble about it. It's really the university that's doing this. It's not WARF, but we want to serve them, and we want to make sure that there's an opportunity to do great things, that WARF is helping to do that.
That is a really good mission to have in life, I think. Kevin, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with me today. It's been really fascinating. This is one of the greatest conversations I've ever had with anyone. I've learned so much today. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
The Next Leap is hosted by me, Thierry Heles. The music is composed by Alex White, and the cover art is designed by Jenna Clark. If you enjoyed today's discussion, make sure to click follow or subscribe depending on your platform, leave us a rating, and make sure to recommend this podcast to your friends and colleagues. And if you've learned something cool, why not share it on social media? Make sure to tag me so I can see it too. If you have any other feedback, are interested in being a future guest, or you have a project you think I could help with, email me at thierry@thenextleap.is. That's THIERRY@thenextleap.is. I will be back next Tuesday when I will be talking to Eric Iverson and Mike Patch about the current and future WARF. Until then, thank you for listening, or as we say back home in Luxembourg, merci, dass ihr gelauscht habt.